Ruth knew something was terribly wrong the moment her grandson Jaime stepped into her house that night. His eyes were swollen, his cheeks streaked with dried tears, and his small body trembled as if he had been freezing outside for hours. He didn't run in with excitement or jokes. He didn't ask for snacks. He simply wrapped his arms around her waist with a strange desperation. It wasn't the hug of a playful 9-year-old. It was the cling of someone who felt abandoned. When he finally spoke, his voice cracked. "Grandma, they ate in a fancy restaurant while I waited in the car hungry for 3 hours." Ruth didn't interrogate him. She didn't say, "Are you sure?" Or "Maybe you misunderstood." She saw enough pain in his little face to know the truth. She grabbed her keys and coat, her anger rising in a way she hadn't felt since she was much younger. She drove 15 minutes to Mark's house, her hands gripping the steering wheel, her jaw tight. She didn't knock. She used the spare key they had given her years before, saying she would always be welcome, though tonight that promise felt like a joke. Inside, she found Mark and Bianca relaxed on the couch, watching television like it was any other evening. Mark held a glass of wine. Bianca snacked on expensive chocolates Ruth recognized from a luxury store where each piece cost a ridiculous amount. Mark blinked in surprise at Ruth's sudden entrance, but she didn't wait for him to speak. Her anger erupted. She demanded, "How could you leave your child in a car while you two enjoyed dinner that probably cost more than 2 weeks of groceries?" Bianca set down the chocolates and stared with a cold expression. No embarrassment, no guilt, only irritation. Mark tried to calm Ruth down, insisting she was exaggerating. "Jaime was fine, Mom. It was just 2 hours. Maybe less." Ruth shot back. "He was starving." But Mark shrugged, saying time didn't matter because nothing bad happened. Ruth asked if he had forgotten how to be a father. Bianca interrupted with a smooth, poisonous tone. "Ruth, this is between us and our son. We don't need you judging our parenting." Something snapped inside Ruth. It wasn't just the words, it was how Bianca spoke, like Ruth was an intruder instead of a grandmother trying to protect a child. Ruth said she had every right to judge when they treated Jaime like an inconvenience. Mark flushed with anger. "He is my son, Mom. Not yours. We make the decisions. Not you." Bianca folded her arms proudly, like she had won some contest. Ruth suddenly realized this wasn't a mistake. It was intentional. She demanded answers. Mark hesitated, but Bianca didn't. With unsettling calm, she said, "Jaime needs to learn he won't be the center of attention. I'm 3 months pregnant. Things must change." Ruth's mouth fell open. Pregnant. And her idea of preparing a 9-year-old was leaving him hungry in a parked car. Ruth asked if she had lost her sense of kindness. Bianca shrugged. "It worked on me when my sister came. My parents taught me the world doesn't revolve around me." Bianca flipped her hair back and continued, almost bragging. "Look how strong and independent I turned out." Ruth stared at her, disgusted. All she saw was cruelty pretending to be discipline. Mark tried to soften the moment. He said maybe they went a little too far and planned to bring Jaime food but forgot because they were excited about the baby. Forgot. As if their son were a bag of groceries mislaid during a conversation. Ruth reminded Mark that she raised him to care, to prioritize love. For a moment, guilt flickered in his eyes, until Bianca touched his arm and erased it. Bianca smirked. "You spoiled Mark. That's why he's weak now." "I'm not repeating that mistake with my kids." Ruth froze at those 2 words, "my kids." As if Jaime no longer counted. As if the child she once held in her own arms had been erased. Ruth warned that if they mistreated Jaime again, she would take him to live with her. Mark laughed bitterly. "You have no legal right." Bianca's smile widened with satisfaction. That smile was enough to confirm how deep the problem went. Ruth left their house with her heart pounding. When she returned home, Jaime sat on the sofa hugging a pillow, staring at the door as if he feared she might never return. He asked softly, "Is Dad mad?" Ruth stroked his hair and promised nobody would hurt him again. But fear pressed against her ribs because she knew Bianca controlled Mark. The next days passed in uneasy silence. Jaime stayed with her, and Mark barely protested. Too quick, too easy. Felt like avoidance, not trust. Each morning Ruth drove Jaime to school. Each afternoon she picked him up. She saw other children race toward their parents, full of energy. Jaime walked toward her with a forced smile, like someone pretending happiness to avoid questions. One afternoon at the kitchen table while helping him with homework, she gently asked, "Jaime, has staying in the car happened before?" Jaime's hands tightened around his pencil. His throat bobbed. He whispered that 3 weeks earlier his parents went to the movies without him. Jaime said they told him the movie was for adults, but later he saw the tickets on his dad's laptop, an animated film made for children. They bought popcorn, candy, sodas, spent money on a family outing that excluded him. Ruth felt sick. She asked if there was more. He nodded, and the dam broke. Jaime explained that a month ago, on Mark and Bianca's anniversary, they took him to a luxury hotel, only to leave him in the room for 2 days while they dined, swam, and visited the spa. He stayed alone watching television. He said he wanted to join them at the pool, but Bianca told him they needed couple time, and that he was old enough to understand. Ruth's hand shook. She asked why he hadn't called her. Jaime lowered his head and whispered that Bianca told him if he ever complained to Grandma, he wouldn't be allowed to visit her again, because Grandma was old and didn't need that stress. Worse, Bianca warned that children who accuse parents end up in places where nobody wants them. Ruth nearly collapsed with rage. A grown woman had threatened a 9-year-old with abandonment. Ruth forced herself to breathe before responding. She told Jaime none of it was his fault. He had done nothing wrong, and he could always come to her. Jaime cried silently, the kind of tears children learn to hide when they believe no one cares. Later, Ruth called her daughter Denise, hoping someone in the family would understand. Denise listened, then hesitantly defended her brother. Denise said Ruth might be too harsh. Maybe Mark and Bianca were just stressed. Ruth answered sharply, leaving a child alone for hours is not a parenting style. It's neglect. Denise sighed with irritation. Mark loves Jaime. They're just adjusting to the pregnancy. There it was again, the pregnancy as excuse, shield, and justification. Ruth asked if she had ever made Denise feel forgotten when Mark was born. Denise stayed silent. Before hanging up, she warned Ruth not to start a family war. Those words haunted Ruth. Still, she searched for clarity. She called Jaime's teacher, Mrs. Carter, a woman who had always been kind during school events. Ruth asked if she'd noticed changes in Jaime's behavior. Mrs. Carter paused a long time. Then she admitted Jaime had become quiet and withdrawn. He no longer raised his hand in class. He stopped playing at recess and instead sat drawing. Twice he fell asleep in class. He only said he was tired. When questioned, Mrs. Carter shared something that broke Ruth completely. During an art activity, the class drew family pictures. Jaime drew himself, Ruth, and his dog. No parents. When asked why he didn't include Mark and Bianca, Jaime said, "They're busy with more important things." Ruth hung up and sat in stunned silence. This wasn't one careless moment. It was a pattern of exclusion. A child was learning he had no place in his own family. Ruth decided to speak to Mark directly, without yelling. She chose a cafe far from his home, neutral territory. Mark arrived late, his tie loose, eyes shadowed as if he hadn't slept. He ordered coffee without making eye contact. Ruth said gently, "We need to talk about Jaime." Mark exhaled loudly. "Mom, I already know what you're going to say. Jaime manipulated you. He's dramatic." Ruth stared at him in disbelief. A 9-year-old doesn't fake that kind of pain. Mark insisted kids exaggerate. He suggested Jaime misunderstood. So Ruth showed him the messages Mrs. Carter sent about his withdrawn behavior. She showed him the drawing. For a moment, guilt flickered across his face. Then he forced it down. "Kids draw weird things," he said. Ruth reminded him of the 3 hours in the car. Mark corrected her again. It was maybe 90 minutes. And he had the iPad. Unlimited data. He wasn't suffering. Ruth felt like she was arguing with a stranger. She asked whether he honestly believed digital entertainment replaced human care. Mark rubbed his face and finally said what mattered most to him. You should be happy, Mom. You'll be a grandmother again. Bianca is stressed. She needs peace. Ruth stared at him. When did you stop being Jaime's father and become only Bianca's husband? Mark stiffened and defended Bianca as an excellent mother. Ruth asked why an excellent mother threatened her son with losing his grandmother. Mark denied it, but his voice shook. Ruth gently repeated Jaime's exact words. Mark shook his head like he could erase reality. Jaime makes things up, he claimed. Ruth said maybe Mark didn't know Bianca as well as he believed. Maybe Bianca acted differently when no one watched. Mark suddenly stood, chair scraping. Enough. Jaime stays with you until Friday. Then he comes home. And if you interfere again, I'll limit your visits. The threat stunned Ruth. She sat frozen, realizing Mark had not chosen her. And worse, he had not chosen his own child. Mark walked out of the cafe without saying goodbye. Ruth remained seated, staring at the cold coffee she could no longer drink. She stepped outside, letting the sounds of traffic wash over her. She sat in her car for several minutes before turning on the engine. She needed to breathe and accept a painful truth. Mark would protect Bianca before he protected Jaime. When she picked Jaime up from school that afternoon, he hugged her tightly and asked, "Is Dad still angry?" Ruth forced a smile. "He just needs time." But Jaime whispered, "You don't have to lie. Dad always chooses Bianca." His honesty felt like a knife. A 9-year-old should not understand emotional abandonment. At home, Jaime went straight to the guest room where he had been sleeping all week. He shut the door quietly. No crying. No noise. That silence terrified Ruth because it meant he was getting used to hurt. Ruth sat in the kitchen and called Denise again, trying once more to make her understand. But Denise said, "You're overreacting. Mark has his own family now." Ruth answered sharply, "Jaime is part of that family." Denise fell silent, then mumbled that Ruth just hated losing control. Ruth ended the call, stunned by how easily her daughter minimized the situation. She looked around the quiet kitchen. She had raised 2 children with love, protection, and consistency. Now she watched one emotionally damage his child while the other defended him. That night, Ruth sat with bills and a calculator. If Mark tried to keep Jaime away, she might need a lawyer. Retainers, hourly rates, documents, everything cost money. She had savings and a paid-off home. She could fight if necessary. But her darkest fear whispered another question. What if she lost anyway? What if a judge decided parents always had full authority, even when they harmed their child emotionally? What if Jaime remained trapped in a cold household with no one to defend him? Ruth stared out the window at the dark street. Streetlights cast long yellow bands across the pavement. A storm was coming. She could smell the rain in the air. He checked on Jaime. He had fallen asleep hugging a pillow. On his nightstand lay a folded paper. Ruth opened it carefully. It was a letter he had never given to anyone. The handwriting was shaky. "Dear Dad, I promise to be better so you love me more than the new baby. I'll get better grades and won't ask for things anymore. Please don't forget me. Signed Jaime." Tears filled Ruth's eyes. She sat on the floor beside his bed, holding the note, crying silently so he wouldn't wake. A child should never believe he must earn the love of a parent. Friday arrived too fast. At 6 in the evening, Mark appeared at Ruth's door. He came alone, no Bianca, which felt cowardly to Ruth. Jaime packed slowly, folding clothes like each item confirmed a goodbye. Mark entered and shouted, "Jaime! Time to go." Jaime came into the hallway with his backpack hung from one shoulder, moving without excitement. He didn't run to his father. He simply waited like someone waiting for instructions. Mark ruffled his hair. Mom made your favorite dinner. Ready to go home, champ. Jaime nodded but said nothing. Ruth stepped between them before they reached the door. She said firmly, "If Jaime goes, I want rules." Mark frowned. "Rules?" Ruth nodded. "He calls me every day. I will pick him up from school on Wednesdays to spend the afternoon with him. And if something feels wrong, I'll get him without warning." Mark rolled his eyes. "You're overstepping." Ruth didn't raise her voice. She stared him down. "You already left a child in a car. Forgive me for not trusting your judgment." Mark clenched his jaw. "Bianca is his mother. She decides." Ruth replied, "Being pregnant doesn't erase responsibility." Mark growled, "Are you calling Bianca irresponsible?" Ruth didn't blink. "I'm saying Jaime is scared." Mark muttered something under his breath, then called Jaime again. Jaime stepped out the door slowly. Ruth followed them outside. She crouched in front of Jaime and adjusted his backpack straps. "You call me every night. Understand?" Jaime nodded, his voice smaller than ever. "Yes, Grandma." She cupped his cheek. "I love you." Jaime whispered, "I know." Mark cleared his throat impatiently. They left. The weekend passed without contact. Sunday evening, Ruth's phone finally rang. Jaime spoke in a whisper. "Can I come back?" Ruth's heart tightened. She asked, "Are you safe?" He hesitated, then said yes, but he wanted her house. In the background, Ruth heard Bianca complaining loudly about noise. Ruth told Jaime she would pick him up Wednesday after school as planned. When she hung up, she stared at the wall. Something inside her changed from fear to resolve. She knew action was coming. Wednesday, Ruth arrived early. She leaned against her car, watching the school doors open. Children ran toward parents, chattering and excited. Jaime walked out alone, scanning faces until he spotted her. Relief washed over his features. He hurried to her and hugged her waist. In the car, Ruth asked casually, "How was it at home?" Jaime stared at his shoes. They didn't talk much. Bianca stayed in her room. Dad said she needed rest. Ruth asked softly, "Did you eat dinner with them?" Jaime shook his head. "Dad brought food to me." That sentence unsettled Ruth. "Brought food to you?" Jaime nodded. "To my room." He didn't want to bother Bianca. Ruth tightened her grip on the steering wheel. They reached her house, and Jaime relaxed visibly. He settled at the table, coloring. Ruth watched, thinking. Later that night, she heard Jaime on the phone with Mark. The conversation was brief. Mark asked if homework was done and ended the call. No warmth. No interest. Ruth felt anger rising like a fire ready to spread. Thursday morning, Jaime seemed more cheerful. He hummed while tying his shoes. Ruth realized something. The child felt safe when he wasn't in his own home. That evening, she researched child emotional neglect laws. Definitions, examples, court outcomes. It frightened her. Emotional abuse was difficult to prove unless physical harm existed. She closed her laptop and put her hands over her face. "Evidence," she whispered to herself. "I need evidence." She wished Mark would wake up on his own, but Bianca's influence was heavy. Friday afternoon, Ruth picked Jaime up again. They stopped for ice cream, and Jaime smiled the way 9-year-olds should. He told her about a drawing he made in school. When Ruth asked what he drew, he answered, "Me at Grandma's house." He didn't mention his parents at all. Ruth asked gently, "Do you miss Dad?" Jaime shrugged. "He loves Bianca more." Ruth corrected him softly. "Parents can love more than one person." Jaime shook his head. "Not him." That night, Ruth tucked Jaime in and turned off the light. She stood outside his door and made a silent promise. She would not let neglect shape him. On Saturday morning, Mark called. His voice was tense. "Jaime needs to come home today. Bianca wants a family weekend." Ruth asked, "Is she ready to include him?" Mark snapped, "Don't start." Ruth told him she would bring Jaime after lunch. When she hung up, Jaime looked nervous. "Do I have to go now?" Ruth nodded sadly. "For now." She drove him to their neighborhood, each block feeling heavier. Jaime stared out the window, silent. When they arrived, Bianca opened the door wearing a bright smile that fooled no one. "Jaime, come greet your baby sibling," she said, placing his hand on her belly. Jaime stood frozen. Bianca laughed and told him, "You'll get used to not being the only one." Mark stood nearby, avoiding Ruth's eyes. Ruth crouched and hugged Jaime. "Call me tonight." Jaime nodded weakly. Hours passed with no call. By 9, Ruth dialed Mark. No answer. She tried again. Still nothing. She texted Jaime's tablet. No response. She went to bed with dread twisting in her stomach. Sunday morning, Mark finally called. His tone was casual. "Sorry, Bianca was resting." "Everything is fine," Ruth demanded. "Let me speak to Jaime." Mark hesitated, then passed the phone. Jaime sounded distant. He said they were watching television. Ruth asked, "Are you okay?" Jaime paused. "I guess." That uncertain answer haunted her all day. By Tuesday, she decided she needed eyes on Jaime in his home environment. She called Denise again, hoping someone would stand with her. Denise refused. "I won't spy on my brother." Ruth hung up. She stood alone in her living room, realizing she could no longer depend on family. She would have to protect Jaime herself. She grabbed her coat and car keys. She didn't have a concrete plan, only instinct and concern. That afternoon, she drove to Mark's house. She didn't ring the doorbell immediately. She sat in her car, thinking through what she might say. Then she stepped out and knocked. Mark opened the door with visible annoyance. "Mom, what now?" Ruth said calmly. "I want to see Jaime." Mark said he was sleeping. Ruth replied, "Wake him." Bianca appeared behind him, touching her belly dramatically. "You're stressing the baby," she accused. Ruth felt her temper rising. She forced herself to stay steady. "I'm here for Jaime," Ruth repeated. Bianca snorted. "You can't just take him whenever you want." Ruth said, "I want 5 minutes, then I'll leave." Mark sighed and allowed her in. Ruth walked down the hallway to Jaime's room. He wasn't sleeping, he was sitting on the floor, hugging his knees. When he saw her, his eyes widened with relief. "I knew you'd come," he whispered. Ruth knelt and hugged him tightly. She whispered, "You are not alone." Jaime clung to her. Mark watched from the doorway, expression unreadable. Ruth stood and said, "We're going to fix this. Somehow." Bianca scoffed. "There's nothing to fix. He's just dramatic." Ruth looked straight at her. "A dramatic child doesn't cry himself asleep." Bianca crossed her arms, unwilling to listen. Ruth realized a long fight lay ahead, but she would face it. Jaime needed her. And she would not fail him now.